webinars. I'm Engelbert Stockhammer, happen to be the chairperson of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society. And we are having a webinar today under the heading of Post-Keynesian Economics and Developing Countries. This is part of a series of 3 webinars. The follow-up one will be on the 6th of May and on the 27th of May. These series of webinars, if you want, have a double origin. The first is related to COVID. The Post-Keynesian Economic Society usually has a big annual workshop once a year, and we decided that in COVID times we didn't want to switch online with it, essentially because we think that the networking aspect is very important for that. But we decided that instead we wanted to move online and do webinars, a series of webinars instead. The second point of origin for this event is that when we thought about these webinars, we thought that we wanted to use that to strengthen our international networks. PKES as a group wants to, we as PKES have this funny role that on the one hand, physically we're a very British group, but virtually in terms of our email list, working paper series and so on, we play an international role. We would like over the next years to strengthen our international role and our international networks. And one of the things that we did in this context is reached out to various friends, post-Keynesian and other countries, to think about what they are doing and how we could cooperate with them. And there's 2 cooperations that came out of that. One, you see the first incarnation of that today is with colleagues from Argentina. The second one you will learn about in the next weeks. After this series of webinars, there will be webinars with colleagues in Italy. And when we discussed the idea with our Argentinian friends, and it's Florencia Medici and Pablo Bortz, who are the co-organizer from Argentina, we thought about the topics, and essentially we wanted to do webinars on what post-Keynesian economics can tell us about the situation of developing countries and what post-Keynesian economics can learn from the experiencing of developing economies. So we will have today's seminar that is on financial dynamics in developing countries. We will have a second seminar on post-Keynesian economics, productive structures and economic development on the 6th of May. So in a way, today's meeting is on the more financial side. The second meeting is on the more real side. And we'll wrap up on the 27th of May with post-Keynesian economics and other heterodox traditions in Latin America. And if you want the conceptual two-way street between developing or economic theorizing in developing economies in Latin America and post-Keynesian economics. Now, for our Argentinian friends, this is also, if you want, an occasion to strengthen their own network. And I think Pablo wants to say a few things about the Argentinian network. You have muted yourself again.
There. Well, thanks everybody for participating in this. Thanks to Engelbert for coming up with this initiative, and with Florencia Medici. We have set forward in a path to engage a vibrant, perhaps so far disseminated and disconnected post-Keynesian community that exists in Argentina, And we want to do it by establishing the Argentine Post-Keynesian Association, or in Spanish, Asociación Post-Keynesiana Argentina. The initials are chosen wisely so that they are the same in English and in Spanish. And with also a pluralistic approach, because we acknowledge that there are several traditions in Argentina and in Latin America, which can be certainly considered friendly or akin and compatible with a post-Keynesian approach, and also some other organizations with which we would like to establish connections that we know, heterodox organizations as well. But first, to develop and strengthen this post-Keynesian network in a very pluralistic fashion, we will organize more events and calls throughout this year to launch this post-Keynesian association. And we will keep you updated about what new things about the new things that are coming throughout this year.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. With that, I essentially want to tell you what is planned for today. So we'll have presentations by Nina and by Pablo. The instruction is that they are not allowed to talk for more than 25 minutes. And then we shall have a joint discussion of both papers. A few words on our two speakers. Nina Kaltenbrunner is Associate Professor at the University of Leeds. I will have to say that the thematic topics for both our speakers actually will have a strong overlap. So there may be a bit of repetition there. Nina is working on developing economies and in particular on financial flows. Has also done interviews with financial or exchange rate traders. And I think it has gone again in the chat. Oops, sorry, my computer is fighting against me. In the chat, I wanted to say that Nina has just co-edited a fascinating new book, which I wanted to put into the chat. And indeed, it already is there, but my computer refuses to post the image again. Yes. Eventually, the human ingenuity has won over modern technology. And in the chat function, you can see the cover page of the book Emerging Economies and the Global Financial System that Nina Bruno-Bonizzi and Raquel Ramos have just brought out, which in a way covers a quite similar terrain to what we are talking about today, which is how you apply heterodox economics, post-Keynesian economics, to the experience of emerging economies, in particular with an eye on what it means in terms of financial structures, financial flows, financial instability. Pablo Bortz is a scholar from Argentina, based in the Universidad Nacional de San Martín, and is their associate professor. He has quite a bit of work on global financial flows, but also on the history of economic thought of heterodox economics. And both of them will be talking about, in various versions, about financial flows and developing economies today. With that, Nina, over to you. And you need to unmute.
That as well. My slides have suddenly gone again without me doing anything. Can you see them? No.
I'm afraid not.
Yeah, then let me try to, I don't know what happened. Let me try whether I can find them again so successfully as I did last time. Sorry for that. Cool. Can you see them?
They are coming. Yes, we see them.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation and for presenting there. The paper we'll be presenting today is slightly peculiar, and it's a bit out of my comfort zone. No, it's not out of my comfort zone, but it has brought me sometimes out of my comfort zone. But it's a labor of love together with 6 other colleagues, and it has come out of a little ISRF workshop grant, pre-COVID, of course, where we could all get together and think about what we call international financial subordination, or basically the fact, or our sense, the structural subordination of developing and emerging economies in the global economy. So we met a couple of times in person, and then over the last 2 years virtually, and to, I think, everybody's surprise, we actually managed to produce a paper. And so what I want to present today is that paper, and it's the first time I'm presenting it. So we're all very interested and open to criticism and reflections. And I guess just as a post-Keynesian, so as you can see, it's a mixed group, Marxists, post-Keynesian, institutionalists. So I think as a post-Keynesian, I've probably learned as much about what post-Keynesian economics can contribute to international monetary and financial dynamics as it cannot. But so much to that. So what does that paper try to do? That paper basically tries to do something both very simple and very ambitious. And that is, we want to propose the concept of international financial subordination, which captures developing and emerging economy structural subordination in international money and financial markets. And by doing so, in a way, the overarching aim of that is to initiate a critical and interdisciplinary research agenda, which systematically engages with this structural subordination. So that proposal, or this concept, or in a way the whole paper, has come out of this sense that whilst there is quite a lot of literature which systematically, and interdisciplinary literature which systematically engages with international productive subordination under the big umbrella of global production chains, global value chains, global commodity chains, there's actually very little, or there's nothing in the same sense that does that with let's say DEE's international financial and monetary subordination. So we wanted to kind of make a step in that direction, say, well, why can't we think about such unified and joint systematic research agenda around what we think are these kind of processes of structural subordination? And empirically, it's motivated, of course, by the observation that DEEs are subject to processes different to those in developed economies with regards to financial integration, ranging from heightened external vulnerability, exchange volatility, financial crises, macroeconomic policy constraints, and so on and so forth. And more than that, also the impression that all of these processes are not only macroeconomic phenomena, but of course, by being that, also perpetuate or shape the everyday practices of actors in developing and emerging economies. And as I said before, and also a sense that these processes are in a sense structural, that of course domestic policy measures can make a difference about them, but at the end of the day, they're structurally inherent to global capital accumulation and the way these countries are integrated in that global capitalist system. Just very briefly, the related literature. So, mainstream economics or international policy institutions do acknowledge that DEEs are subject to particularly violent processes of crisis, external vulnerability, etc. But at the end of the day, most of them are, or they're mostly ascribed to domestic weaknesses like shallow financial markets, lacking financial institutions, or a history of financial crisis and sovereign crises. And by doing so, there's also a sense that they can be addressed with domestic policy measures or even capital controls or macroprudential regulation, but they can be dealt with. So there's, they can be dealt with the system, and by adhering to these policies, DEs should be able to integrate into the global economy sustainably. On the other hand, we do have a big, and there is a big literature in heterodox economics ranging from Marxist theory, Post-Keynesian, Latin American structuralists, which are concerned with these negative implications of DE's financial integration. But our sense is that by and large, that literature is quite empirical and motivated by these empirical boom and bust cycles, and doesn't really try to conceptualize or systematize the structural nature, this process of international financial subordination. On the other hand, there is that literature in international political economy, which is concerned with the structure of international monetary system, but that literature focuses primarily on the role of the US dollar and maybe its contenders like the euro or the Chinese renminbi, but up till now has had very little to say about the implication for developing and emerging economies. Now, the literature we come from, and in a way we are part of, is a recently emerging one. It's quite an interdisciplinary one, and comes out of Post-Keynesian economics, Marxist theory, Latin American structuralist, which basically tries to analyze the structural subordination of DEs in monetary and financial markets, and bases itself on traditions and histories in heterodox economics, ranging from dependency theory, structuralism, Marxism, and post-Keynesian economics. And of course, within post-Keynesian economics, the most famous tradition, if you want, so that the most famous theory is probably currency hierarchy, although we can discuss that. Now, our sense, though, is that literature, while it's growing, it's still quite unsystematic, it's quite fragmented, and it's in different disciplines, it doesn't really speak to each other very much. And so what we quite like to do is to in a way, lay the groundwork for some collaboration, more systematic engagement with that, and some systematic conceptual reconstructions or engagement with this concept of international financial subordination. So what we then do in that paper, we really try to ask the question, well, is there something like IFS? What is it? How can we theorize it? What are its potential underlying structural determinants, historical roots, and how can we think about that politically? And you can imagine, I have to say, it was one of the most amazing things, other than having 3 children over the last years, to work on that paper, because the discussions have been so fruitful and so helpful. And so I mean, more than the paper is actually the process in this case has been very, very illuminating in doing so. So what we do in that paper is we start with a working definition of IFS. So what do we think, in a way, how can we broadly define it? What are its main features? And then the paper is divided into 2 parts. In the first part, we're critically engaging with 3 macrostructural literatures, which we think can make contributions or can help us to create that concept of international financial subordination. So these are dependency theory, post-Keynesian theory, and Marxist theory. And then, based on that literature, we try to identify theoretical concepts or methodological tools or key issues around which we could build that concept of research agenda around international financial subordination. And what I want to do in this paper is to primarily set out, given the time limits and my tendency to always run out of time, what I want to do is to basically set out these 6 axes, and then maybe see in the discussion in the Q&A what we think about them. So I'm not going to go into the detail into the different schools of thought. I've got here a quick summary. What are its main concerns? Of course, dependency theory is mainly concerned with core peripheral relationships and colonial legacies. Post-Keynesian theory, as I said, has this concept of currency hierarchy, and Marxist theory is interested or concerned with social relations of productions and imperialism. That then spills over into the main key agents, whereas in dependency theory, we do have nation states, but also domestic elites and domestic capital. Post-Keynesian theory is primarily concerned with the nation states and the implications on the nation states. Marxist theory, of course, has a concern with class relations and different segments of capital. Just very briefly then for them, so what are the key elements of international financial subordination? For dependency theory, it is colonial legacies and weak productive relations, although there is a small stream which also looks at financial subordination, particularly Maria Conceição de Tavares. Then there's, in the post-Keynesian literature, the main analytical emphasis is on the macro constraint and the macro policy making, and in the Marxist political economy, it's on the recurring financial crises, austerity, and of course also value transfer in the form of profit remittances and interest rate differentials. Finally, maybe what are the driving factors? Going back to dependency theory, colonial legacies. In post-Keynesian economics, the foreign exchange constraint, but also partly the structure of the international financial system, so particularly in the work with Bruno and I have been developing. And then finally, in Marxist political economy, weak industrial capital accumulation and the interest of financial capital, which manifests itself in the state, or influences the state apparatus. Limitations, I guess all of them, I mean, and in a way I will talk about these limitations when I talk about the 6 axes, but I guess all of them have in common that they're macrostructure literature. So they're not so much interested or don't have space and time to go into the individual and the day-to-day practices of how IFS perpetuates itself, but are looking at the broader structural processes, which of course is also their advantages. And I have little to say about space or these axes. So that's just very briefly an overview. I can't go into detail. The paper has a very detailed discussion of all these different approaches, but I wanted to spend more time on the different axes, on the different elements of this potential research agenda around the concept of IFS. So the first one we identified in our discussion, the first thing is the importance of history. So any engagement in a way with these structural processes of subordination needs to acknowledge that they're historically specific and manifest themselves in concrete historic conjunctures. And that's potentially, and that's a critique that has been made in a group of post-Keynesian currency hierarchy, and I can acknowledge that in a way that is sometimes it kind of, delinks itself from the historical processes in which they emerged and kind of becomes ahistorical. Whereas I think, or the dissent in the group, or the development was that any kind of agenda around IFS needs to appreciate or needs to acknowledge that these processes are historically specific and contingent processes. And there was, there was a long discussion around, how, between continuity and rupture, which I say wasn't something I've been so familiar with. But in a way, what we want to propose here is that really we need an engagement with history that both acknowledges the continuous or kind of enduring process of financial subordination so Kai has been working on is it shells which they've used in African trade and the subordination there up to the current stage of subordinate financialization. So we need to kind of engage with history both from a vantage point that appreciates the kind of the continuity of this process, but also how the manifestation changed. And here we've been particularly influenced by Jeff Powell's work on subordinate financialization, and the argument that really the current processes of IFS, international financial subordination, are structured by the completion of the world market or the internationalization of production and offshoring, etc., and how this interacts with financial processes. We can go more of that in the Q&A. So the first thing is to acknowledge that IFS is historically specific and comes out of specific conjunctures. The second element which we think is important or can unify or work around an IFS is to acknowledge that in the interdependent and symbiotic relationship between financial and monetary subordination and productive relation. And what we found in the literature, in a way, there is probably, again, by nature, because we cannot capture everything, but there's a bit of a divide on the one hand, what we call the productivist view, or the productivist bias in Marxist and probably also dependency theory, and then that monetary financial bias in post-Keynesian currency hierarchy literature, which does not sufficiently acknowledge the productive and real economy patterns or processes which underlie the currency hierarchy dynamics. So really ideally what we would want to do is to acknowledge the symbiotic relationship with productive and monetary subordination and how they feed and relate to each other. And I want to give some example at the end, if I have time, of how from a post-Keynesian point of view we could do that. Now, in the paper, we found, or we would quite like to suggest that particularly suitable here could be to engage with the Marxist understanding of the dialectical and mutually constitutive relationship between the various circuits of capital. And the argument that actually IFS, International Financial Stability, can be located in each of these three circuits and feed and impact and maybe exacerbate into each other. And that not only allows us to have it, and I think this is what I really learned from my work with Jeff, that doesn't only allow us to have like a systemic and global view of IFS. So IFS doesn't happen in national economies by themselves, but has to be seen as a systemic element of how global capitalism works. But it also allows us to kind of acknowledge both structure in that sense and also variegation, because every country will relate differently to the different circuits of capital and will integrate differently into this global system of capital accumulation. So that's the second part, symbiotic relationship of finance, of money and finance. The third one is, of course, the role of money. And I being a monetary Keynesian, that of course came naturally, and this is really where we started. But my Marxist colleagues also, we had also so extensive criticism here is that whilst that focus on money is extremely important in post-Keynesian economics, and particularly in the literature and currency hierarchy, the focus on the money functions and the inability to fulfill international money functions and the implications that has for monetary subordination also runs the risk of becoming overly technical and in a way neglecting the historical and political processes underlying them. And I think one very valid point which has been raised and we have got in the paper is that when we come to kind of, if the policy conclusion is to fix money functions and to make sure, all currencies can fulfill international money functions, we very quickly run into that kind of dead end of asking, well, can the international monetary system ever be flat? Can the Brazilian real ever take over any of the dominant currencies, or are we, are we getting there to a dead end? And again, so the at least in addition, if not replacing it, the sense was that a stronger engagement with a view of money as power relations, as social relations of power, and also capital as a whole, can in a way foreground a bit more the political aspect and the power relationships of international monetary subordination, and not only frame it in technical terms and what needs to be regulated and fixed, but also just kind of highlighting the political struggles or the way capital dominates or exploits labor across the globe. But again, I want to come back to that in the end, because I think that's probably one of the most difficult issues and tensions. Then the fourth set is the state and the role of state in international financial subordination. And again, the post-Keynesians have taken a bit of a stick here, but we can discuss this. And so far, particularly in the post-Keynesian literature, as I've indicated before, IFS has been largely expressed in a way as a constraint on state action and what the state and DEs cannot do, ranging from macro policy management, exchange rate management, etc., etc. And in that sense, for restricting international integration, something like capital controls or capital account regulation are always seen as something increasing policy space, and it does so. But in a way, again, what that overlooks, or maybe doesn't give enough attention to, are the underlying class dynamics and the fact that the state is in itself a way of mediating these class relations, given a certain accumulation regime. So here, rather than rather than just focusing on the constraints which IFS creates, we also need to look at in a way the enabling things it provides certain classes, or at least certain actors in DEEs, and the role of the state in mediating and shaping and organizing the different class relations depending on an accumulation regime. So that's number 4. Anyway, these are the most difficult ones: history, money, production, and the state. And then the 2 final ones, which I think hopefully we'll all agree with. I think the 5th one, and that was actually the starting point of our project, is that in a way, whilst we economists or macrostructuralists are very important in highlighting the underlying structures, we're not so good in analyzing the day-to-day practices of DE actors and how they sustain, they're both shaped by and also perpetuate international financial subordination. And we've looked at bit here at other literatures, particularly economic geography and economic anthropology, who have very interesting insights of how these processes work, for example, through corporate governance rules, but also through narratives and stories around, for example, emerging markets or Africa Rising or the Africa Risk Premium, which could enrich such a research agenda around IFS. On the other hand, one has to say, and again, this probably comes by nature, these literatures are not very good in acknowledging the underlying structural patterns or processes which influence the actions by these agents. So they themselves, so increased dialogue between this agency structure could be definitely fruitful. And finally, there's the sense that, and Gary and I have been doing a bit of work on that, acknowledging space and really the spatial specificity of certain processes, may this be through financial centers, tax havens, urban city dynamics, could be an important element of that research agenda.
Nina, 5 more minutes.
Perfect, because I only have a few concluding slides left. So I've actually come to the end already. So just to summarize, what we wanted to do is we wanted to propose this research agenda and this concept, and really to kick off a research agenda. And it's a very simple aim and hopefully appreciated aim, is to just bring together scholars from different disciplines concerned with these monetary and financial processes and structures. And by identifying these kind of 6 axes, we thought, this could be, these could be some kind of, way of centering and unifying is not the right word. I'm still struggling to find the right word, but basically kind of creating some common language maybe and some common themes and axes around which this research agenda could center itself around. Just very briefly, so for example, what could that mean and from a post-Keynesian, because this is a post-Keynesian workshop and working on this and thinking this through, what are the things that I learned from this paper and I really think have opened new avenues of thoughts for me. So for example, if we go through these 6 axes in terms of history, as I've said before, very often in my work, in discussions, it became very clear that actually what we're talking, that this dominance of the dollar is very specifically anchored in World War II, the role of the US in the Marshall Plan, in dealing with the repercussions of World War II, etc. So it's not an ahistorical situation. It's deeply ingrained, embedded in these specific historical conjunctures. Now, with regards to production, I think for us post-Keynesian, I think there's a lot of, and particularly those working on currency hierarchies, I think there's a lot of interesting future research that can be done in bringing together more the literature on balance of payments constraint and really the kind of the productive subordination, the commodity dependency and currency hierarchy. It's implicit, but I think maybe we don't do enough work that makes it implicit. Now, the role of money and, regulation versus revolution, I think this is a difficult one because I think we do need to also, the socialist revolution sadly is not around the corner. And I think we do need to deal with the reality which we're facing and providing certain policy regulation and fixes is, I still think absolutely crucial, but maybe we as post-Keynesians can also be a bit more aware of the political tendencies. Same as with the state. So I think we do sometimes underestimate or do not pay enough attention to the state and the class relations underpinning them and the actors. And I think with the actors, I think particularly I was pushing back a lot towards that kind of, critique that IFS or currency hierarchy always is portrayed as this constraint on actors, and it's taken me a long time to come around that. But I think maybe we do need to appreciate that actually these structures can also create immense opportunities for DE actors. So if you just think about the carry trade, a Brazilian non-financial corporation which can navigate both the onshore and the offshore market can make a lot of money. These are not weak actors. They can actually profit from these subordinated structures. And the same with space, but I've looked into this. Now, final word, of course. So, I think, it's a tricky paper, and we'll see whether we're going to be able to publish it. And of course, there's no expectation that any paper can fulfill or can speak to all these 6 axes. And of course, they're also not exclusive, but we do hope that they help to unify and center and bring together people working on this and concerned with this, and maybe that it helps to build this interdisciplinary and cross-theoretical, so not just between disciplines, but with also different theories in heterodox economics, to develop this more politically attuned research agenda around financial subordination. I'm done.
Brilliant. That's actually exactly on time, and it also was a brilliantly broad and integrating presentation to kick off our webinar series. Pablo, over to you.
Let me try to share my slides. That was a wonderful presentation, and I will have things to add in the Q&A. But for now, I have to concentrate on my presentation. Can you see it well?
Yes, we see it.
Great. Well, my presentation is based actually on a chapter in the book edited by Annina, by Bruno, and by Raquel. And it's titled Global Financial Flows in Kaltenbrunner Models, which are one of the strands, a significant literature within Post-Keynesian economics. This will be the structure of my presentation. Very few basic points on how Kaltenbrunner models deal with the trade balance, and then starting to move forward a bit chronologically, a bit in terms of topics and themes, how Kaltenbrunner models have incorporated factors and variables and indicators related to the financial account. First, dealing with the capital account, or in net terms, then analyzing external debt sustainability, the impact of fluctuations of external financing, and then a model that I developed together with two co-authors, Gabriel Michelena and Fernando Toledo, a model in which we emphasize the importance of gross external debt. To summarize very, very briefly, Kaltenbrunner models, the early Kaltenbrunner models analyze the interaction between functional income distribution and growth, rejecting the unnecessary negative relationship between higher wage shares or higher real wages and economic growth and investment. There in this literature, falling wages might lower economic growth through their impact on consumption, aggregate demand, eventually investment, and capacity utilization. The first Kaltenbrunner models that included the trade balance are works by Robert Blecker and the pioneer seminal work by Baduri Marlin that I think it might be one of the most quoted heterodox papers of all times. I've quoted myself almost in every single work I ever done, in which rising wages, a falling profit share, is detrimental to external indebtedness, though Blecker puts a bit of a nuance in that argument, saying if falling profit share comes through falling markups instead of rising wages, then we might have an increase. We might observe an increase in competitiveness. There have been several models, empirical models by Heine and Vogel in 2008, Onaran and Galanis. Engelbert has done a few, which were inspiring for my PhD. There has been extension of this model, for instance, to include conflicting claim inflation dynamics by Misaglia, von Armin, Cassetti, and the impact of devaluation. There is an interesting work by a Brazilian economist called Rafael Ribeiro. Now, the current account. The first attempt to include foreign assets and liabilities and rates of return, focusing on net capital flows, which is the inverse of the current account was done by Massimiliano Lamarca in a couple of papers in the 2000s. It has 3 blocks, as will be seen, which characterizes the approach. First, an income distribution block with a sort of Phillips curve, in which higher capacity utilization leads to a higher wage share with a certain adjustment speed. And it's important to notice this fact, which is a fact, that the real exchange rate is negatively related to the wage share, and that has implications for the conclusions of this work. The aggregate demand block has an investment of a Baduri-Marlin type, in which investment reacts to capacity utilization and to the profit share. It has savings from households out of wage and dividend income, and firms from retained profits, and the external interest dividends or payments. They are the ones who borrow from abroad in this model. The trade balance has typically demand and exchange rate sensitive components, and capacity utilization adjust according to the difference in investment and saving plans and the trade balance. How is the current account determined? Well, it's governed by imbalances in domestic savings and investment, net export, interest payments, and revenues. It's if investment reacts stronger, if savings react stronger than investment, then the trade balance will improve with capacity utilization. However, stability requires that investment reacts stronger than savings to external revenues, and I will show you why in this particular slide. It's a typical characteristic of this type of models that higher price elasticity of export makes the system more profit-led. However, there is a difference whether the country is a creditor or a debtor. If it is a creditor, an appreciation, which implies higher wage share, lowers the income of interest revenue measured in domestic currency, while a depreciation increases. The opposite happens with if the country is a net debtor. If it is a debtor, an appreciation will lower the burden of external indebtedness. Therefore, a creditor position makes the system more profit-led because an appreciating exchange rate regime has a negative impact, while a debtor position makes it more wage-led because an appreciating exchange rate makes it, like I say, lowers the burden of external debt. And the model itself set a precedent for future work. I can mention, for instance, the work by Danilo Spinoza, who has extended the models by Lamarca. A very interesting paper by Carsten Kohler, who I think is among the attendees of this webinar. He analyzes the impacts of devaluation on external debt denominated in foreign currency. Here we have debt borrowed by firms. They can be in domestic currency and from international lenders. The effect of devaluation is as in Blecker, differentiating between the impact on margins and wages, and depends therefore on the bargaining position of capital and labor. The investment function, a typical characteristic of Kaleskian models, includes capacity utilization, the profit share, but also the negative impact of external indebtedness. So far, this is nothing new. In the medium run, in this model, the external debt to capital ratio is endogenous. Both rates, as I mentioned, there is a possibility for domestic and external indebtedness are sensitive, but in varying degrees, to external indebtedness. Domestic borrowing is typically more expensive than external borrowing because it pays a liquidity premium, which incentivizes firms to borrow abroad. However, obviously, movements in the exchange rate later might complicate the stability and the financial balance sheets of borrowers. For the stability of the external debt to capital ratio, what is needed, actually one has to look as well to the domestic borrowing, because it acts as a buffer in the sense of providing liquidity funds when external finance is not available. For that, domestic interest needs to be not too sensitive to external indebtedness. Otherwise, both borrowing sources would become expensive. And therefore, for stability, the growth rates needs to be higher than domestic interest rates. What is the impact of devaluations, which is one of the key questions that Carsten tries to answer in this model? Well, if devaluation stimulates capital accumulation, it is stabilizing. If it is contractionary, it is destabilizing. It's not a close question that devaluations are expansionary. That is not actually, if you would ask a Latin American economist, if you ask me, typically it has a contractionary short-term, at least short-term effect. And there is a significant literature, for instance, Florencia Medici, who is also one of the founding members of APCA, has done some very recent work along this line. So the wage-led or profit-led character is an important fact for whether devaluations can have a positive or negative impact on external debt sustainability. Furthermore, as since there is an importance of capital accumulation, debt crisis might arise even if Marshall-Lerner holds, because that is, even if the trade balance improves, but not that much, so that the trade balance improves, but capital accumulation might decrease. And as I mentioned, that's one of the typical cases in Latin American economies. And Argentina has gone through too many episodes of these characteristics. This is a graph taken from Engelbert, from Carsten's paper that summarizes this counteractive and different possibilities. There is a paper by Guimaraes, Coelho, and Pérez Caldentey, which allows, it's very interesting because it represents, it can accommodate in a very simple way alternative of opposing financial developments. One of these opposite financial developments is, on the one hand, I think at this stage, well-known financial instability hypothesis by Minsky, and it also can accommodate one of the critiques or alternative possibilities that has been emphasized, for instance, in the work by Marc Lavoie, which is the paradox of debt. In the financial instability hypothesis, leverage by firms that is external source of funding, grow along the cycle, are pro-cyclical. The paradox of debt puts a nuance, a question in that development, so that internal funding, internal finance may grow more than external finance along the cycle. The key to this paper is the investment function, as is typical of Kalecki models, and it includes the profit share and capacity utilization. But it also includes the impact of internal finance and external borrowing. First, let's look at the closed economy. Internal finance is the difference between gross profits, which is captured by the first item, and interest payments. If internal finance respond more to capacity utilization, if gross profit respond more to capacity utilization than interest payments, then we are in a paradox of debt world. If it is the opposite, we are in a speculative or Ponzi regime, the case of the financial instability hypothesis. External finance, in turn, depends on liquidity preference and of lenders. And Guimaraes, Coelho, and Pérez Calentay adopt a very simple way to include this. In an upward phase, there is availability of external finance, there is lower liquidity preference. In a recession, there is no external finance available. So, in an upward phase with paradox of debt, firms are more sensitive to internal financing and therefore to sales, to consumption, than they are to external financing. So, in a paradox of debt upward phase, the economy is more likely to be wage-led because sales have a significant impact on internal finance and therefore on investment. The exact opposite happens if the financial instability hypothesis case holds, which emphasizes borrowing, external borrowing. In a downward phase, with no external financing, the less sensitive investment is to internal financing, the more significant is the more it is a wage-led case, because as I mentioned, sales are going down. In an open economy, external financing comes through the current account balances, which in the model of GCPC to some breadth, depends on technological gap and income distribution. The model assumes the type, what I call, and what the authors call, a Furtado's impact. Inequality worsens the current account because of the luxury consumption of elites, which weighs heavily on imports. So, inequality worsens external, higher volatility worsens external financing. See, the regimes, the hypothesis, remain similar to the case of a closed economy, but with some nuances regarding the impact of financial instability hypothesis. I think I have a few minutes to present what the model that we've done, as I mentioned, with Michelin and Toledo, and it focuses on gross flows. For instance, reserves are not modeled. The exchange rate is driven by capital flows, and there are two counteracting effects of rising debt, as I mentioned in this, which draws on the work of Massimiliano Lamarca. On the one hand, rising debt appreciates the exchange rate and therefore lowers the burden of external indebtedness. But it also increases debt servicing. So there is this counteracting effect that will drive the model. It has an income distribution block with conflicting claims inflation. It has an aggregate demand block in which, as I mentioned, external debt and exchange rate appreciation have counteracting effects on income distribution, investment, and economic activity. Why on income distribution? Well, firms try to pass on their interest costs onto prices. But if the exchange rate appreciates, those interest costs measured in domestic currency may fall. But the debt servicing keeps building up. The same holds for the impact on investment. It might be cheaper to borrow abroad in order to invest, but once your interest payment starts to build up, you are faced with significant balance sheet problems, and your investment is reduced. This allows us to this allows us to develop, together with traditional regimes, the demand wage-led and profit-led, the debt regimes according to debt-led or debt burdened. We developed two more regimes, in this case income distribution regimes, which are the exchange rate driven regime, in which the wage share reacts positively to increments in foreign indebtedness because of the appreciation of the exchange rate, and the debt service driven regime, in which the wage share reacts negatively. There are three stable combinations of these regimes. What we call the normal case has a debt service driven income distribution regime and a debt burdened demand regime. It's normal because for us it is, and there is a lot of evidence that growing external indebtedness for developing countries has a detrimental impact both on income distribution and on aggregate demand and economic growth. What we call the strange regime, which we think it's more feasible in a short run period, combines exchange rate driven distributional regimes and debt-led aggregate demand. The conciliating debt regimes, under a certain parameter configuration, has an exchange rate driven distributional regime, and so that an appreciation of the exchange rate rises the wage share, but it has a negative impact on aggregate demand because of its impact on export. So one can analyze through this model the impacts of more external indebtedness, which is driven in the model by the risk perceptions of external investors. This model can accommodate different extensions. For instance, income policy to moderate wage and price decision. As I mentioned before, the model has a conflicting claims approach to inflation. It can accommodate capital controls in order to discourage external indebtedness by firms. It may have a negative impact on income distribution because it's another cost, And for instance, we modeled a tax on foreign borrowing, which increases government revenues, the fiscal surplus, and therefore it has also a detrimental impact. Finally, it can also accommodate fiscal rules that we include in a chapter with in a book edited by Louis-Philippe Rochon and Virginie Monvoisin. Different types of fiscal rules which are not traditionally included in Kalexian models. I think that I'm right on time. Thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoyed this brief summary. And I stop sharing my screen right now.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that, Pablo. So thanks to Nina and Pablo for two very interesting presentations. And it was a very nice combination of, on the one hand, a very ambitious research program, and on the other hand, a specific model on how to analyze the impact of current account openness in a developing country context. We have about half an hour for Q&A. Who would like to kick us off? You can